this is Tina Wright here for Week 7 Design Systems, Training and Education, prepared for MPA545 Dispute Resolution and Labor Negotiations, led by Dr. Telleria. Quick overview, I will be going over dispute design systems, the use of an ombudsperson, training for workplace conflict, and training for conflict in management in groups. First off, let's start with dispute design systems. A dispute design system is an institutional attempt to create collaborative processes between individuals that can address conflicts and then manage them. And that's in our text. The article, The Culture of the Missing Link in Dispute Systems and Designs, really kind of addresses how often there's a missing component in when designers kind of begin to go over systems and create systems for new workplaces, and they ignore the current norms within the system. When they're designing systems, they don't really take into account creating a system of what people are actually doing. They create a system of what people are supposed to do. And so if you design something that goes completely outside of the cultural norms, the processes will likely fail. One of the examples that I have is that one of the agencies that I worked in continually had complaints about communication. And to resolve the communication problem, the management would send all the leaders to communication training, and then they would go back and think that everything was fixed. And then they'd send out surveys again, and still communication was a huge problem. And I think that what they were doing is they because of the surveys they were sending out, weren't asking the right questions or weren't being answered thoroughly enough. They weren't getting down to what the real problem was. And come to find out, it wasn't necessarily communication from top down, it was communication from bottom up that needed work. So instead, they could have used informal intervention or discussions and trained, instead of the upper management, the employees on how to discuss things or bring about difficult topics with their managers. And then that way they would have addressed the communication problems. You would have had a level of bottom-up communication working properly and then top-down communication working properly to solve the problem. The second article that I found was a news article, and it talks about an ombudsperson. So an ombudsperson is an independent professional that investigates citizen complaints, usually against a government sort of agency. And in the news article, I found a tenant angry he had to take the landlord to ombudsman over a nightmare neighbor. The tenant filed several complaints with the housing authority that he had an antisocial neighbor who was basically making his life miserable, and he was tired of insufficient results that he received from the housing authority, so he consulted an ombudsperson. And the ombudsperson found that the housing authority was in error and they did not address the complaints as they should have, and they acted more as an arbitrator to resolve the problems. The news story sort of provides an example of where a dispute can occur in a public agency, and had the existing process worked as intended through facilitated discussion, everybody could have made, or the housing authority could have made a real difference in resolving the resolution of the conflict between the two neighbors. They could have encouraged cooperation of the tenants and created a more harmonious neighborhood. So that being said, the training that could go along with this particular example, send the housing authority to training to deal with actually addressing each complaint as it's handled, to carry out facilitated discussions with the tenants, and really to create cooperation with the tenants and adherence to the housing policies. The next two topics I decided to cover were in training themselves. So the first one here is training for conflict in the workforce. And this video is fantastic. I highly recommend that you go and watch it. Right off the bat, the speaker, Liz Kislick, goes straight to the point that sometimes, even though we're trained in how to handle conflict, we cannot resolve the issue when it isn't properly identified. And she continues on to discuss how to get to defining the issue and then training on how to assist groups in resolving the issue or individuals in resolving the issue. I kind of want to refer back to my initial problem with the communications I discussed earlier for my example for this one. Again, surveys were sent out in an attempt to address the problem, and management interpreted the surveys in a particular way. However, had someone else sat down directly with employees and discussed in greater detail what kind of communication they're having problems with, they may have discovered that the underlying issue was more of a bottom-up communication rather than a top-down communication, and therefore they could properly get training out there. So how can this be addressed later? By informal discussions, of course, getting to know, the employees and what the actual problem is, and then by training on facilitated discussion for the employees, and finally training the managers on addressing issues and managing expectations for them. Finally, we have training for conflict in groups, and I found a video and a journal article on this. And so I really found this video pretty interesting on conflict resolution training and how to manage conflict in under 6 minutes. It provides users with some tips in preparing groups and setting expectations when conflict arises within the group, so everyone can return to really finding that homeostasis within the group and continuing to fulfill the purpose of the group. And I found that the stages that the Techman stages of group development that is discussed by Miller, pretty interesting. So I went ahead and pulled up her article, and that's where the journal article comes from on, again, Techman's stages of forming, storming, norming, and performing. In the video, Ms. Witt points out that group leaders can use this model to remind members that conflict is normal, and we use it along with other evaluation methods to really determine if the conflict will fuel the group process or if it will stop the group process, and if it will stop it to maybe table it later, and if it will fuel it to kind of carry it through and find resolution for it. But in the article, what I found most interesting was that they were kind of going through these developmental stages, and it said that if the storming stage is either non-existent or too easy to overcome, then often you end up with a kind of group think, and you really don't want that in your group either, because you might end up with folks passively agreeing, and you really want the group stuff to be meaningful, so you don't want the storming to completely go away too easily. Okay, for an example that comes to mind here, we have the student committee and the administration coming together on campus to discuss the handicap spots within the parking lot, and the fact that there just aren't enough handicap spots, or they aren't big enough for the student population to use. But while they're discussing this particular issue, other kind of complaints come up about there's not enough parking for motorcyclists or bicyclists either, and all of these need to be addressed. So a decision really needs to be made by the administration and the committee together whether or not these complaints are really relevant to the whole parking issue at hand, or they want to keep, this particular meeting or complaint just localized on handicap parking in general. And so for training or for stages that you would need help with in utilizing work with these two groups, I really would suggest kind of like the mediation here, and mostly the mediation because you want somebody to come in and act as a mediator to really either narrow down the focus of what our complaint is here, or make sure that everybody is on the same page on what needs to be discussed and how it can be accomplished. And so I think the best way, again, is to bring somebody in the administration or the student committee into some sort of mediation training, or automatically have a trained mediator on the grounds to help with this sort of situation. And that way the group can move forward and find a solution. Well, thank you all again for listening. I look forward to viewing your presentations. I am sending out great prayers for everyone for a fruitful week 8.